My name is Victor Stefan Maskhadov. I was born on May 8th, 1984, and I am now 40 years old. I left my family when I was quite young. The details concerning my departure are of no consequence just yet in this tale, but in time all shall be revealed. I was born into a strange family which inhabited a little visited tract of land in the southern Moscow Oblast. There, for generations, they had lived in isolation, nursing and building on the remnants of old wealth with the financial genius of my uncle and father. I had left them under the pretense of joining the modern world, but in truth, I had fled their traditions and my own identity among them. It had begun when my own parents had left abroad to see the world apart from their kin. During this time, while we traveled, I became acutely aware of the seeming absurdity of my clan's predilections and beliefs. While my parents viewed the outside world as a mockery and a lie of the true power of nature and the order of the universe, I had acquired a perception of it as grandiose and far above the ridiculous fancies of my lineage. My family, the Maskhadovs, had long maintained a closely held belief not only in the existence of the spirit world, but also in their own ability to communicate with it. The belief that by some divine providence they were possessed of supernatural powers had become a primary factor in their ongoing traditional heritage. Although we traveled for only a year, it was more than enough time for me to witness the contrasts to the outside norm by which I would form my adolescent judgments. Upon returning to the secluded estate of my forefathers, I vowed to leave as soon as the opportunity presented itself, which I did 4 years later. I was barely 18 when I left, promising to never return. I had severed all ties with my bloodline. Never was a letter written or a phone call made. I worked as a laborer and educated myself as best I could. In time, I found my calling and became a computer software designer, working for a multinational affiliate of the Japanese conglomerate known as Yamashita Enterprises in Germany. I enwrapped myself in the solid realities of the physical world. I treasured money and luxury above all else. I attended no church and had no principles of philosophy whatsoever. In retrospect, I now see that I had buried myself in the ideals of a materialistic society. It proved a cold and empty sanctuary indeed. When a man came knocking at my door in Hallsberg one spring morning with news of my parents' death, I was so removed from that distant, hidden world that I could have closed the door and never thought of them again. But as greed had become such a driving factor in my everyday thoughts that I listened with growing interest as he described the vague details of an inheritance that was left to me in their will. Within a week, I resolved to endure whatever awkward formalities may be necessary and return to my home country for the reading of the will. The Maskhadov family had at one time engendered a dual spirituality which had risen to the forefront of the public consciousness in the early years of the 20th century. During a time of mediums, seances, and spirit photography, the family name had become synonymous with an obscure brand of occultism. The main legend concerning my family had been a tale concerning my great-grandfather who, after being sentenced to imprisonment in a katorga for his political views, had been executed for his prophecies concerning the future of the Russian people. His body, upon being returned to his family for burial, had been desecrated and the skull removed. It would later be learned that the skull had in fact been taken by his own son, Afanasy, under the pretense that his father's spirit was speaking through it. Legend has it that the skull now possessed a fountain of supernatural insight and began the dictation of a bizarre text which would become the central defining artifact in my family's history. This volume, known as the Book of the Skull, claimed not only to describe the afterlife, but lay out the intrinsic mechanics of how the universe functioned on a metaphysical level. The book would be banned, and my family forced into hiding. Throughout the endless years of my childhood, I had never seen a ghost or fallen into a trance even once. I was assured by those around me that in time the gift would come, and I would be the recipient of the true sight. Now in my mid-30s, I was still as of yet free of this particular gift. I had in fact become convinced that my family suffered from an ongoing genetically carried form of some acute mental illness of which I, thankfully, had been pardoned. My return to Moscow was one of bittersweet reminiscence. The city had been a place of great hardship and struggle as I had fought daily to make my own way in a world that I did not comprehend. It was in those days, after the death of Stalin, when reformists had begun an erratic and hurried attempt to erase the past and usher in a new and better age for the Russian populace, that I had toiled daily in my own attempt to remake myself. Now, as I left the train terminal, I saw the same man who had come to my home in Harlsberg standing patiently beside a black Volga 21. He saw me and without expression opened the back door and gestured for me to enter. "Hello, Victor," he said, and as I approached, I saw a vaguely familiar form huddled in the back seat, calmly smoking a cigarette between his thin, ancient fingers. After a moment, I recognized the passenger as my Uncle Yuri. I was shocked to see him at such an advanced age, and had to remind myself that it had been almost 2 decades since I had last seen his face. I loosened my tie and removed my coat as I seated myself, and my uncle's agent closed the door to my side. Even though it was a warm spring morning, my uncle sat with a blanket draped over his legs, smiling as the car started and we began our journey through the city and across the Moscow airport. "Victor, it's so good to see you," he said warmly, as he patted my leg. Being the last male descendant of his brood, I was glad to see Uncle Yuri had come to greet me in person, as he had always been the kindest and most well-humored of my relations. He was a seasoned businessman who had dealt regularly with the outside world, and although a Maskhadov, he had separated his personal beliefs from his work. Yuri dabbled in several areas of business, but was most well known as a broker and dealer in foreign investments. He was something of a dual personality and had long acted as a bridge between our family and the worldly economic dealings. "I truly wondered if you would come, my boy," he said as he flicked his cigarette out the window and gazed at me with his eyes, sharp, blue, and keen despite his years. "I wondered myself if I would even be welcome," I replied honestly. "It is good that you did. There's far more to the matters at hand than I relayed in my message. This is no simple reading of the will." His expression now took on a clear credulity as he studied me with thoughtful intelligence. "Victor, the old generation is dying out. I and your dear departed father were all that was left of the old family. Your parents, besides just leaving behind their own holdings and possessions, were also shareholders in most of the family assets. It would seem that they left all their holdings to you." I stared at him with surprise. "I'm sorry, Uncle, but I find it difficult to believe that they would leave me anything, let alone all of what you say. You must understand that they knew that even if they had bequeathed their estate to me, it would matter little, as I have very few years left to manage it myself. That means that as far as our family is concerned, eventually, all will be left for you and Diana." I felt my pulse quicken at the mention of my cousin's name. Diana was Yuri's daughter, and had been my constant companion throughout our entire childhood. She was my opposite in all things, and was the embodiment of the Maskhadov spiritual essence. However, she would be woefully incapable of managing any of the family's financial affairs. "So what exactly are you saying, Uncle?" "I am saying that your parents wanted you to return to the family, and do what you should have done long ago. Realign yourself with family tradition. I reminded myself that I was no longer the hot-headed child who had stormed off into the night, declaring myself free of such tradition. I was now a grown man, and it was my responsibility to treat these people with respect despite my personal judgments, at least until I could gain some perspective on the best course of action involving this complex situation. I am sorry, Uncle, but even now I cannot be the person that you wished me to become. You are what you are, Victor, and no matter what that is, you will in fact become solely responsible for this family's financial future. But Uncle, I have no children to continue our heritage. No, but Diana does. His words fell over me as if with the weight of a boulder. So, Diana did marry? I said this with a sense of loss, which surprised even me. Yes, a few years after your departure, she married, and 13 years ago bore a child. Sadly, just last year her husband died in the same event which claimed the lives of your parents. It was then that the car pulled into the airport and drove along a side section of the personal aircraft where we came to a small helicopter which sat upon its own landing pad. The driver, now our pilot, escorted us from the car, where we climbed inside to begin our journey far from any recognized town to the secluded estate. My uncle handed me a set of headphones with a microphone attachment which I placed over my ears as the propellers of the craft began to spin slowly outside. After we had lifted off and began our ascent, I attempted to renew our conversation. Your agent would not tell me how they died. With good reason, Victor. I told him to withhold this information for fear that it would dissuade you from coming. They were murdered, Victor. Your father and Diana's husband were killed last winter while they were attending a conference in Moscow. Someone broke into their rooms and stabbed them brutally to death in their sleep. I was left speechless with surprise and horror. But who? And why would anyone want to harm them? That is a question which I have been pondering ever since. However, I fear the answers are not those which you wish to hear. If you have brought me here to reacquaint me with the morbid tales of spirits and prophecies, then I will only disappoint you, Uncle. Whether you believe in these things or not, Victor, you must accept that there are people who do, and many of them have harbored resentments and hatreds towards our family for generations. I am certain that it was through these people that your parents and Diana's husband met their end. You are saying that I might be in danger. I am saying that it is the strongest of possibilities. Who would want to do such a thing? I said, full well knowing that his answer would most likely be linked to the nonsensical family belief system. He scrutinized me for a moment as I sensed trepidation lurking in the recesses of his mind. Must we play these games, Victor? You know fully well who has always threatened us. What? Are we going to blame their murders on a hidden secret society who seeks the destruction of our blessed book? I saw a shadow of pain pass over his face as he removed a silver holder from within his coat and carefully withdrew another black gold-filtered cigarette. They've been hunting the last copies since the Second World War, he answered silently. Uncle, there is not, and there never has been, a Vril society. Even if some insane Nazis actually did form a group, its basis was in fantasy. Bulwer Lytton published a book of fiction. Yes, that book may have been fiction, but it does not extinguish the fact that the Nazis believed in its words as fact. They were searching for an occult energy source, and within the pages of the Book of the Skull, those energies were described. And whether you choose to believe it or not, Lytton's book may have been a fantasy, but the tome dictated to Afanasi by the spirit of his dead father is not. could see that I had done exactly what I had attempted to avoid. The anger and injured pride in my uncle's trembling voice was unmistakable. "Uncle, I told you that there is no way I can do what you wish of me. I've spent my entire life trying to leave these ideas behind. To me, they are just fables." He stared out the car window as sadness and disappointment hung over his frail shoulders like a shroud of despair. "What am I supposed to do, Victor? Just let our family vanish and all the wisdom and knowledge we have acquired fall into the hands of these wretched people? That book is a curse on our family, Uncle. Why would you even wish isolation and alienation on another generation just for the sake of some long-forgotten ancestor?" "So be it," he said with sad resignation. "Come and receive your inheritance, and let the rest fall as it may." We traveled in silence as the helicopter followed a winding stream below over the open plains and spotted woods I remembered so clearly from my childhood. Most often when people think of our country, it is represented as cold and hostile, but here the summers could be as unbearably hot as the winters were biting and frozen. The lands surrounding Maskhadov estate were deep forested wetlands spotted with lakes and streams. I braced myself as I laid eyes on the gray stone wall surrounding the virtual community of houses after so many years of long absence. The pilot who introduced himself as Yakov told us to brace for our landing as we lowered slowly into the middle of the wide field, which served as the estate's private airport. The estate originally housed 5 individual family groups in various villas, which sat in a community around the main house, a mansion in which my uncle still inhabited. Now all these houses but one, the residence of my cousin Diana, stood dark and empty around the shining waters of the lake. There were the other smaller lodges which had acted as guest homes for distant relations and business associates, but these too were now vacant. On the far side of the estate was the family cemetery, an acre of markers and mausoleums enclosed in a smaller waist-high stone wall, which ran in a crescent until it met with the formidable main wall. Upon landing, we left, climbed from the helicopter, my uncle aided by his trusted agent, who watched him with the worried eyes of a concerned mother. He led us to a golf cart, which sat in a small roofed port by the side of the hangar, which had housed my father's airplanes. From there, we drove to the main building. As we pulled up to the steps of my uncle's mansion, I caught a glimpse of my childhood home, standing lifeless and dark by the waters of the lake, its windows shuttered and its yard unkempt after seeming months of neglect. I tried to convince myself that the sight of the disregard paid to it did not disturb me, but instinctually I was shamed by the way it had been ignored by the groundskeepers. My parents' home, left to waste in the corner of this once great place, brought a wave of regret from my conscience. Yakov stood protectively by Uncle Yuri as he leaned heavily on his cane and climbed each step as if it were a monumental task. A middle-aged servant woman opened the door from within and took Yuri's coat and hat as Yakov returned to the car for my one suitcase. The inside of the main room was just as I remembered it, a long corridor of paintings and animal head trophies mounted on plaques, covering every available space of wall. We walked to the study, which was Yuri's favorite chamber, and from the looks of things, his primary residence in the 40-room household. The massive room managed to contain an atmosphere of warmth and a den-like hunting lodge appeal. The far wall was set with huge curtained glass doors, which opened onto a balcony which overlooked the lake. I remembered that Yuri spent most of his evenings throughout the spring, summer, and autumn sitting at a table, reading and drinking wine. Even as a child, I could remember him as being reclusive, but now it seemed his natural inclinations towards introversion had finally won out over his more outgoing attributes. He climbed into a large, comfortable chair by the fire and asked the woman to prepare dinner and bring him some vodka. I looked around for my cousin, Diana, but noting the sun was sinking over the distant trees, I assumed she had already retired. Yes, indeed, she is in bed, Yuri said as he leaned forward and jabbed the fire with an iron poker. I grimaced as I realized that he was inferring that he had read my thoughts. Having spent my early years with people who claimed to read minds as easily as casual conversation, I walked to the open door by the balcony and gazed out. I had come to the conclusion that these tricks were merely a practiced analysis of expressions and intuitive guesswork. However, the accuracy of such diversions could be unnerving. "What of Diana, then?" I said, as I remembered the summer picnics by the lake with dozens of people laughing, eating at long tables by bonfires on the lawn. "I would not be expecting a warm greeting if I were you," he chuckled as he took a folder from the table at his side and placing a pair of long, thick-framed glasses on his face, began to read carefully. "Uncle," I sighed as I approached the fire and took the chair beside him, "surely you must acknowledge the absurdity of the expectations which you were placed on me. You were never like the rest of them. You know how ridiculous the old family ways were." "Do I now? And which ways are you referring to?" he said, looking up over the top of the dense lenses. "Uncle, I loved Diana with all my heart. We were raised together like brother and sister. But how could anyone in their right mind have expected me to marry my first cousin?" He stared at me, with a slight smile playing on his thin, gray whiskered face. "So you are insinuating that your father and I were insane now? So we will begin with insults. Must I remind you that your grandparents were first cousins?" "Why stop with cousins then? Why not just intermarry with our sisters and nieces?" "The family is not unaware of the effects of long-term inbreeding, my dear boy, but the integrity of our family gift must be preserved. It was determined long ago that every other generation must take steps to prohibit the diluting of our bloodline and the loss of our power's integrity." "But it is madness." "Well then, you were very wise to dodge that particular bullet then, weren't you? It is obvious that you were very successful at finding your own path to love and family." The not-so-hidden cut at the dismal state of my personal life did not dissuade me. "Diana obviously succeeded," I stated firmly. "Yes, in time, she did in fact meet a man. And since you had abandoned your duties to the family, she was allowed to marry." "Allowed to marry? I'm sure she is delighted with the great privilege of choosing her own spouse." I made no attempt to disguise my disgust with the attitude with which Yuri presented the arrangement. "She loved you, Victor. Nothing would have pleased her more than to be your wife." "As far as you know. Did you read that in her thoughts? Or did you just assume, as it seemed convenient to your own beliefs?" He removed the glasses and rubbed his eyes wearily as he turned them to the crackling flames of the fireplace. "This unending sarcasm of yours is tiresome, Victor. Did you simply come here to chastise us from your pedestal of superiority, or do you seek to shame me into my grave? Do you know how many times your father and I discussed these very same things? How many times we questioned the validity of the old ways? But there is one simple fact which aided us in our decision to adhere to these laws. We believed in our gifts and chose to ensure their continuance to future generations. For whatever reason, you have been blinded to the sight and knowledge we possessed. And I was treated like I was disabled," I proclaimed. "I was made to feel as if I was inferior
because I did not see spirits in every corner and receive visions of the future in my dreams. Mother and father pitied me because I did not play with the Ouija boards and tarot cards from the time I could walk. But it was such an enigma to us, Victor. A grand disappointment, you mean? Do you have any idea the relief I felt when I learned that there was an entire world out there of people who did not despise me for being normal? We never despised you. I'm trying to tell you that we still do not. That is very easy to say now that you need me. Now that I am all that is left of your precious bloodline. My dear boy, all that is required of you now is to take what was left to you and be gone. He laughed out loud as the servant woman entered with a tray covered in 2 plates. And make no mistake, Uncle, that is exactly what I plan to do. So be it then. You will take of all the wealth, but give nothing in return. You truly are, as you have described, one of the greedy wretches that you call normal. It was with these cold words that our conversation was interrupted as the servant woman entered with an adolescent boy in tow. He stood tall and impressive with deep-set black eyes and thick black hair, which was swept back from his high, pale brow in an ebony wave. These eyes stared at me with intense interest as he worked his way past the woman's arm and stood before us. "I found this sneaking about the house," she said with irritation. "Oh, Maxie," my uncle said, as all traces of anger left his voice, and he gazed upon the youth with unhindered pride. "Should you not be home in bed? Your tutor comes out early tomorrow." "Forgive me, grandfather, but I wanted to see my cousin," the boy explained without a fear of reproach. From his mannerisms, I guess that he was not often reprimanded for untoward behavior. "Come in here, then," Yuri said, patting the arm of his chair and dismissing the servant with a wave. "Go on, Svet. He will be fine." She sighed with resignation and left as the boy strode forward and stood at Yuri's side, where he studied me with dark and intelligent eyes. "Victor, this is Diana's son, Maxiimano." I sat momentarily stunned with the sudden familiarity of the name. "We call him Maxie for short." "It is a pleasure to meet you, cousin," the boy said respectfully as he extended his hand, and as I shook it, I noted the inherent strength of his grip. "As it is mine," I replied, trying not to be off-put by the piercing effect of the boy's stare. "I am grieved by the loss of your parents," the boy said with perfect formality. "They were always very kind to me and my mother. They were fine people, as I am sorry for the loss of your father. I regret that I never knew him." The boy looked down thoughtfully for a moment before saying, "You should come and visit my mother at our house. She may not say so, but I think she would like to see you." Once more put off by the young man's demeanor, I answered, "I will be sure to do so." "Go on, Maxie. You will have time to get to know your cousin later. He will be staying with us for some time." I looked at Yuri questioningly as the boy bid us good evening and left, still casting glances at me over his shoulder. "You must know that it will take some time to put affairs in order," Yuri said as his voice once more grew dry and unemotional. "I suppose, but please understand that I must return to Germany soon." "Yes, of course. I'm sure that they cannot build another one of their god-awful computers without you." I sat in silence as I reflected over all I had said with the feeling that I had already ruined any chance of reconciliation with my harsh words. I thought of apologizing, but knew
that even the attempt would be a shallow and pointless endeavor. You may go now to your room. Sveta has arranged quarters for you by the gallery. I nodded and left without another word as the servant woman appeared, as if bidden by a call I had not heard. She led me through the house, down a long hall filled with portraits of various family members. I stopped before the largest, which hung in a place of honor over a long table covered in numerous candles. It was a painting of Maximiano Maskhadov, the Katorga prisoner who was the legendary posthumous author of the Book of the Skull. He stood tall and imposing, with a long black beard and deep, brooding eyes, dressed in the garb of a peasant worker, with a scarf tied over the waves of thick, dark hair. At the time of his imprisonment, the Maskhadovs had been a renowned band of traveling entertainers and fortune-tellers, similar to gypsies in look and lifestyle. Looking at the painting, I found it easy to imagine him as a rebel spy, working with the Narodnaya Volia for the overthrow of the Tsar. This was the man after whom they had named Diana's son, and even at his young age, he bore a striking resemblance to his namesake. Legend had it that while imprisoned, Maximiano had begun having visions, and had foretold the fall of the Tsar and the advent of a new government, which in turn would fall into tyranny. He had claimed that the only way to avoid this would be for the people themselves to rise up and claim themselves free from both the Tsars and the communists. These claims would ultimately lead to his execution, and later the complete ban of the book allegedly dictated by his dead spirit. I had always doubted the validity of the tale. It was absurd to think that this vagabond had foretold the coming of 2 world wars, but within our family such tales were accepted as indisputable truth. Urged by the impatience of Zeta, I followed her into my room, and there was left alone with my thoughts for the night. Despite the comfort and elegance of the chamber, I was besieged by violations of memory from my past. The faces of my parents appeared in every dream, and if I managed to flee them, I was met with Diana, the woman of whom I was raised to marry. She was present at every remarkable event of my entire childhood. We had fought like brother and sister, but relied on each other like best friends. Often, I had wondered if I should have ignored all of my doubts and resentments, if only so that I could have remained by her side. But I had abandoned her as much as I had left behind my parents, who I had felt so alienated from. I had loved her, and upon finding the world in judgment of that love, had been repulsed by my own feelings, and in turn, her. In the morning, I awakened early, and as breakfast was hours in the making, I made my way from the back servants' entrance and took off across the estate on foot. I followed the winding stone path, past the long unused stables, and on to the small airstrip and hangar where my father had kept his beloved airplanes. He had been an avid aviation enthusiast and had kept flying as a passion throughout his entire life. The dawn was slow and bright over the trees as I wandered the field towards the sounds I heard echoing through the morning mist. As I approached the hangar doors, I half expected to see my father, busily at work, fine-tuning his personal sport cub for some summer flying. But instead, I was met by the sight of Diana, standing at the propeller, working at the engine. I stood frozen with panic as she turned and looked at me with the same dark brown eyes I remembered identically from my childhood. The long ringlets of her curly brown hair were pulled back in a ponytail as she climbed from the stool on which she stood and stared at me with calm indifference. "Get away from me," she stated, as she walked back to the cart of the tools which sat behind her, and she began rummaging through them before snatching a socket wrench in her hand as if she would strike me with it should I approach. 1,000 words I had prepared flashed through my mind. But the sight of her as a lovely, adult woman, filled with hatred towards me, left me speechless and dumb. "Diana, I don't know what to say," I stammered. "Then say nothing. Take your money and leave." She strode back to the plane and began working awkwardly with shaking, furious hands. When I did not move, she threw the tool to the ground and moved forward so quickly I thought she might attack me. "How dare you return expecting your inheritance after you scraped us from your shoes like shit? You are not worthy to bear the name Maskhadov, you foul, greedy filth." There was no mistaking that if I had stood my ground, she would have physically assaulted me. "Get away from me, and stay away from my son." I backed away as she neared, her face red and distorted as her eyes burned with rage. All at once, something broke inside of me, as a floodgate of indignant pride burst forth. "You make it sound as if I came calling. May I remind you that your father sent for me? How many times did anyone try and contact me before then, Diana? Once? Twice? No, never. No one cared if I was alive or dead up until now, and all of a sudden, I am asked to forget the fact that no one ever wanted me here until I was the last option. I wanted you here, Victor. I didn't care if you had the sight or not. I loved you, even if you were, what, Diana? Even if I were incapable of indulging in these bizarre family fantasies which have persisted since the Middle Ages. There is a whole world out there, Diana, and most people that do not leave offerings to dead relatives instead of attending the Sabbath. What would you have done if I had asked you to leave with me? What if I had asked you to leave behind your cards and spell books for a job slaving in some factory? Would you cut fabric 7 days a week? Or wait tables just to be with me? Tell me, Diana, was your husband a laborer? Or did he just happen to be rich and well-educated like the perfect little prince you always wanted? My words had cut through her vengeful anger like a knife and left her trembling and lost with confusion. You could have found me, dear cousin, I said, my voice with a bitter, icy chill. You could have written a letter, or called me and said, I still love you, Victor, or even, we are still friends. But no, you chose to let me scurry away into the darkness. You, your father, and my parents, you all carved me a tombstone and placed it over a plot in the family cemetery the day I left here. But unlike all the other dead members of this family, you chose not to converse with my departed spirit. Perhaps it would have been more to your liking if you could have talked to me through a skull or a Ouija board. I was soaring with a vengeance now as I saw the hurt in her eyes. It must have been so easy to all sit around and agree on what a shameful, mundane wretch I was, while all I wanted was to be with people like myself. I realized that I abandoned this family, but make no mistake that this family left me as well. I turned and stormed away from the building, feeling the eerie sense of reenacting the past. I stopped for a moment and took a deep breath as I fought to contain the consuming maelstrom of emotion which was devouring me to my core. This was not what I wanted when I returned here. I had not come back for revenge, and yet here I was, again, tearing away at people who were the last of my family. Why could I not be stronger? Why could I not be wiser? Why was I so weak? And then behind me, I heard her voice. Victor, she called through the fog. I turned and saw her standing at the top of the hill, her face covered in tears. I still love you. Seeing her so hurt and lost was unraveling my tapestry of guilt and resentment into bare threads blowing on the breeze. All of the years of loneliness and denial had been building up like a ravenous animal in the dark caves of my soul. There had never been anyone else. I had never loved any other woman but Diana. You know why I came back? I said as I began to walk back towards her, my heart pounding in my chest as the cascading light of the red morning sun washed over the tragic beauty of my cousin. I just wanted to see you. My confession poured out like cold mountain water rushing over the embers of a long burning fire. I wanted to tell you that I was sorry, and I know leaving you was a mistake. She rushed towards me and fell into my arms as finally I felt something in my life had turned. I may never see a spirit, and I may never utter a prophecy, but I would fulfill at least one piece of the destiny that this cursed family had plotted. I would be with Diana.